So starting with Puja. So Puja Changoiwala is a prized independent journalist and writer based in Mumbai. She takes a deep interest in social, humanitarian, and socio-ecological issues as she tries to make the world a better place by denouncing the abuse and scandals hidden from the majority. She has published two non-fictional works, a novel called Homebound, published in 2021, as well as numerous articles in Indian and international medias. As a journalist and author, she often intervened in major international events, took part in several associations, such as the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and was welcomed by varied residencies, the last one being, of course, Ariel. Fiction and non-fiction are at the heart of her work. She takes her inspiration from reality and sees fiction as the combination of creativity and truth, enabling her to be the storyteller of those history has forgotten.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Solin, for that new introduction. You seem to have worked hard on it. Uh, my name is Pooja. We know that. My hands are sweating, so I'm going to take it slow. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Monica, John, Natalie, and of course Barbara, Celine, and everybody for organizing this. They say your wedding day is all about you, so this feels like a second wedding day, except that I'm not wearing a 44-pound skirt. So thank you for that. And it's such a pleasure, such an honor, and I'm just looking forward to hear everybody talk. Um, Now let's begin. Before I talk about my creative process, I'd like to tell you how and why I became a journalist, because journalism is inherent to my writing and it's the inspiration for all my books. So I was always a good student, and if you're a good student in India, you either become a doctor or engineer. So I studied science. I was on my way to becoming a doctor. And during my first year of graduation, there were two dissected frogs in front of me. And it was my examination. And my teacher asked me to point to the testicles of the frog. And I pointed them out. And I was pretty sure they were the testicles. But it turned out to be a female frog. So I realized that this is not for me. And I had to do something else. I went through a few aptitude tests, and again, I spoke good English. I mean, in India, so when you have guests over, how your parents ask you to perform for them, our parents asked us to speak sentences in English. So I was good at that, and my aptitude test also suggested that I should be, somewhere in the media. So that's how I wanted to do mass media, but I hadn't applied for any entrance exam, and that meant I had to waste a year. So in India, how it works is that if you want to get into a college and you don't have the grades, or if you haven't applied for entrance tests, you can buy a seat. So there was a college which is one of the best in Bombay and Mumbai, and it told me that it would charge me 3,500 euros for the seat. And I went to my father and I told him that, listen, you have to pay this, otherwise I'll waste a year. And he said, no, I don't pay for education. And I'm like, but you can afford it. You're rich. And he was like, no, I don't pay for education. And I was pissed. And because I was pissed, I went from college to college in Mumbai. And I begged them for admissions. I landed in a college. I did very well. I topped it, and I went to that college without paying a fee. They in fact, they invited me because I'd done so well. So this was one of, the first major achievements of my life. It was something that taught me how to fight, and that has been useful to my career ever since. For instance, even when I had to go to London to study MA, do my MA in journalism, I had to fight this cult of patriarchy in my own home. My grandparents, who thought that I should be, like a good wife, like my mother, who should learn how to make round rotis and please my husband. So I was able to fight all of that because my father instilled that in me, and that's how I went to London. And the reason why I mean, in my bachelor's, I had a choice between journalism and advertising. Advertising paid money, journalism was journalism. And I did not know what to pick. And that was the time when the 26/11 terror attacks happened in Bombay. And I was young, I was stupid. There was a hotel which was under siege at the time. And I remember I cried because 256 of us were killed. And I couldn't understand why I cried because I did not know any of them. And I went to that spot. It was risky, it was scary, but I went there and I wanted to see a dead terrorist. Of course, I couldn't see one, but I came back knowing what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a journalist. And that's when I went to London and I did my MA in journalism. And I think London was completely, it broke me and it made me. It made me first, the most important thing I think was it made me recognize the injustices which were ingrained in my own life. I've had a very, very happy childhood, but there were certain things which were so mundane that I did not even recognize them as injustice. For instance, when I'd get my periods, I used to sleep on a different mattress. I used to eat in a different plate. I could not talk to anybody in my home without washing my hair. I could not enter the temple. And when I went to London and I saw everybody's going to church every Sunday, aren't these women getting periods? And it was a bit surprising to me. And that's when I realized that, oh my God, this could be wrong. And so, I mean, I think it made me a lot more self-aware. It told me about my privileges. Of course, since I'm in London, I am privileged, but political privileges, like my classmate from Saudi Arabia who couldn't so much as drive, the Afghan refugees who lived in exile. Then there was, just a second, yep. It taught me how to question political propaganda. So I made a documentary about these Tibetans who lived in exile in London, and I spoke to some Chinese nationals, and they told me that, oh, Tibet is a part of China. How can they even say that? And I realized that they're so brainwashed that they do not even realize that Tibet was occupied. And then I'm like, oh my God, I am so brainwashed that I did not realize that Kashmir, they've done the same with Kashmir. So I think it made me think, it made me realize who I am, and it paved. Way to become a journalist. So, I always say that there are no life-changing moments, but there are life-changing experiences. And London was that for me. I came back and I will get to the creative process, guys, patience. I came back. I started working with Hindustan Times, which is one of the largest national dailies in India. I was a senior crime correspondent with them. I covered gender based violence, custodial torture, financial frauds, Indian prisoners abroad, terrorist attack trials, cyber crimes. I did stories about police officials who wouldn't register complaints, leading to rapes and murders. I won several awards. I remember particularly this story about this man who was an IT engineer. His name was Irfan Jafri, and he was working in Sudan on a United Nations project. And while he was in Darfur, he was captured by Sudanese rebels. And I found out about it through my sources. I did a story about it. All the other media houses picked it up. The Ministry of External Affairs took notice, and the man was brought back. So these were the kind of stories that I won awards for. But I realized that what am I doing? Because I was writing 12 stories a day, 300-word reports, 12 stories a day, which were aimed more at the newspaper circulation than impact. And then came a moment when I realized that. So it was funny. I was in a high speed chase behind this Bollywood actor who had just walked out of prison, and I was about to ram into a car, and for what? And I realized that if I'm a journalist and if I have to risk my life, I'd rather be doing better things. So that's when I put in my papers and I decided I'll write my first book, and we'll see what happens. Maybe take up another job or something. And it was a moment of faith, and it was a very scary moment. But if there are students, there are of course students here, I would really encourage you to believe in these moments and to take those chances. When my first book is called The Front Page Murders, and it's about this serial killer in Mumbai, alleged serial killer, if this is being broadcasted, who would murder Bollywood aspirants for wealth in Mumbai. What he would do was he had a very pretty woman who he would use as a bait. So he would make friends with these guys. He would kill them. He would sever their body into several pieces and then dump those pieces down a valley, and then he would take over their wealth. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book was because I realized that my years with Hindustan Times had made me cold. I used to be very happy if there was a murder in the city because I knew I had to have something to report. When the boss called me, I'd have something to offer. And this story changed me. This story made me realize who I should be. And that's how I started working on it. And this was my first book. I was young and naive and again stupid, and I did not realize what I had got myself into. Writing is hard, and writing about something so dark is harder. I remember I used to write from this place. My father owns, I told you, he's rich and still he wouldn't pay. My father owns a home near Mumbai, and I used to go there alone and I used to write. And there were times when I was unraveling this serial killer's mind, and I understood exactly why he was doing what he was doing, and I was so scared. And I called Atul, who's now my husband, and he said, "Why do you have to write all these things at night?" So I started writing in the day, and I got through a horrible first draft, which makes me wonder how I ever got published. But I think what worked for me was the process for me was the first thing and the most important thing was that I had a dedicated group of readers, my friends, my colleagues from HD who actually read, who gave me honest reviews, and who made me accountable. I had somebody who was who was asking me where is the next chapter. What worked for me was, and I cannot insist enough how important this is, the structure. I always say, prepare your structure before you do your research. And what worked for me was having that structure in place before I started. So it was a simple structure, the way the story unfolded to me. There were cases in his past, there were cases as back as 1992, but the way it had unraveled to me was extremely, it had a lot of suspense because every day brought about a new detail. So that was my structure, and I divided the book into days when something of consequence happened. To decide on these days, I went back to my news reports, which were published at the time. They became as markers, and then I identified what material, what research I need for every chapter. What worked for me was extensive amounts of research. So, there are two kinds of sources: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are is the material that is created on the spot when an event happens, and secondary sources are analysis. So my book was extremely heavy on primary as well as secondary sources. My primary sources included interviews with the victims were available, their families, the investigating officers, the doctors who conducted postmortems, the defense and prosecution lawyers, jail officials, and the criminals. Um, Getting to talk to the criminals was a bit, I wasn't sure if they would talk to me, but as a journalist and a writer, I have a tip for you: stalk. And stalk until they agree, and that's what I did with the serial killer as well, and I got gems. I got real insights into his mind. I saw how he behaved in court, and he was defending himself. And there was a point when he told me that if rape is inevitable, why not enjoy it? So this is not something that a normal person says. So yes, that's I got to know him better because of that. there was one of his accomplices whom I interviewed, and I asked him, I was young, I was curious, and I asked him, how does it feel killing a man? And he tells me, how did you feel reporting your first story? So I said, a bit nervous. And he's like, yeah, that's it. But it got easier with time for you, right? And I said, yes. So he's like, it's the same. And basically, practice makes perfect. And what worked was holding my own during these interviews. What worked was asking controversial questions, but not indulging into fights with them, and just pursuing them, and making sure that I had a balanced perspective in my book. For my secondary sources, I spoke to psychologists who spoke about living with grief. I spoke to Bollywood veterans who spoke about the life of strugglers in the film industry. I spoke to criminologists who dissected the behavior of these criminals for me. I gathered documents, loads, about 700 pages of documents. I still have that carton at home. These are police complaints, postmortem reports, internal police inquiries, court documents, charge sheets. Uh, I am guilty of bribing a clerk for giving me documents from 1992. I do not advise it. Anyway, nobody takes bribes here. So, but if you're in India, it's easier. I visited places because I feel places speak more about events than people do. I went to the valley where they disposed of the bodies, the villages where they grew up. I mean, you think of a place and it's there in the book, the jails where they were held, anything and everything that was accessible. I gathered data, the torture techniques used by the police, the plastic surgeries that these criminals undergo, the rate card for things in prisons. I mean, you can buy everything in prison, so a rate card for that. And it was all because I believe that the harder you research, the luckier you get. And that is true for my fiction as well as nonfiction. With my first book, I wrote and rewrote the first three chapters a few times. I sent it to an agent at 11:30 in the night, and I had an email from him at 5:30 in the morning. He wanted to represent me, and I remember I cried because I was so happy, because I never thought that it would be so easy for me. But I think it was my credentials of having been a crime reporter. So if you are going to go out there and offer your book for publication, make sure you add one line on why you're the right person to write this book, because that always works. But the publishing process was very easy for me for my first book. My agent pitched it to about 4 or 5 publishers. My multiple publishers, 4 or 5 of whom were interested. And we went with Hachette because Paula, my editor, was very passionate. We had other publishers offering more money, but we went with Hachette, and I cannot tell you how good a decision that was. And that's why I always say this also: please go with an agent, please go with a publisher who is really passionate about your work. Do not go for money. It's very short-term thinking. And I think it was an absolute pleasure working with my editor at Hachette. I mean, she would point out. So I remember there was a 5th victim, and they could never identify who it was because they found the body, they did not find the head. And I ended the book saying, and we'll never know who it was. And Ptolemy was like, but yes, the reader needs to know. So I was like, okay, I'll do some digging. And then I spent months trying to identify the 5th victim. I could not, but then it made for a better end. It made for a much it was still close ended, open ended, but it made a lot more sense. So front page was published to very good reviews, and I decided I had a home to run, so I had to do something. I had to take up a job, but I decided I'll do freelance. And I started off writing for Indian publications, mainly crime, because that's what I knew. Some young men who left to join the ISIS, criminal trials, local cases. But of course, there was this desire to bring about change. And I was actively looking for stories. And that's when I learned about this government scheme called Manodharya Yojana, which was a scheme for sexual assault survivors, whereby if you have been sexually assaulted, the cops register a complaint and you're offered a compensation. And I found out that the committees were not dispensing these compensations because they were moral policing. Essentially, they'd say that, oh, she's young, she must have had consensual sex, or oh, she's rich, she could not have been raped. And then I did a story about it, a very long, data heavy story, and the law was changed. Um, so this that was phenomenal for me, because this was the first time I had actually brought about some real consequence while going off as a freelance reporter. And what worked for me here was, my process here was essentially building good relationships, because I got that story from a woman at an NGO who I had worked with in the past, and who trusted me. Who She was part of one of the committees, but she could trust me because she had known me for a while. So that connection worked for me. The gathering data I filed in India, you have this thing called the Right to Information Act, where you can access data that the government is trying to hide from you. You have an equivalent of it in France also. If you're looking for that data, I think one of the professors found out about this act. And I gathered data from 7 regions in Maharashtra, and it was not easy, but I kept on following up. So that really worked for me. And finally, I had a very good publication, a very well-known publication that published the story and gave me the space to explore this issue. So I think. With journalism, okay, I'll get into the journalism process later in detail. Now, while reporting on crime during these years, I came across a gangster. And what was interesting about him was that he had turned his life around, and he was now a marathon runner. Now, that was an anomaly. I had covered crime, and you see people drown into the annals of the underworld, but you do not see them resurrect. And this was one such man. And I did a story about him, and I just knew there was a book in him. And I asked him if I could do a book about him, and he agreed. Gangster on the Run, the book is called Gangster on the Run, and it came with its own challenges, because this was not about action, this was about interiority. And I wanted to focus on what makes a man the most wanted man in Mumbai, and then what makes him turn his life around. And my process essentially for this book was building a relationship with him, meeting him again and again, really listening without judgment and trying to understand his motivations. So when I teach nonfiction writing, I always say that you want your interviewees to tell you to tell you their secrets, and they're not going to tell you their secrets if they do not trust you. And Rahul did come to trust me in our initial meetings. He told me about the action, how he shot at men, how he managed to evade the law, how he was then arrested, how he argued his own cases, how he won, and he was quite proud of that part of his life. But the more intimate details, they came later. So, for instance, he told me that he told me about events like his girlfriend broke up with him, that a childhood friend of his committed suicide, that his Dawn, who he had risked everything for, had abandoned him. But I understood his feelings much later. I understood that he really believed that whoever loves him leaves him, and that's why he's getting back at the world. So I think what worked for me was letting him discover himself through my interviews, asking controversial questions that made him uncomfortable, letting our conversations drift. I mean, as journalists and as writers, we think we are very impatient. We are like, get to the meat. But and when people babble, we do not like it. But when they're babbling, that means they trust you. So I let the conversations babble, even if they're talking about the disgusting sandwich they had in the morning or the color of their umbrella. I do not care. I let the conversations drift, and that's something that really worked with Rahul. What worked again was exploring his past as it intersected with the rise of Mumbai underworld, its depiction in the popular culture and how it influenced him. Again, data and interviews really worked for me. Documents from 10 years ago, his cases, interviews with family, childhood friends, everybody, the investigating officers, anybody who was remotely connected to him. Again, structure. I cannot stress it enough. Dividing his life into 4 parts and organizing my research accordingly. I divided his life into his childhood, criminal life, trials and acquittals, and redemption. And then I knew exactly where every interview, every document had to go. Another thing that worked for me was being patient, knowing that I was dealing with memories. Gangster on the Run, I think one thing that writing has taught me is to be patient. It requires a lot of patience. It's like more patience than a marriage. Uh, Gangster on the Run was published in 2020, and of course, I was already working as. Have I? No, I'm still. Yeah, yeah. I was still working as a freelance journalist, and by 2019, I felt that crime was. We still have 5 years to go, guys. By 2019, I felt that crime was too restrictive, and that to have real impact, I should focus on other beats that intersect with human rights. And that's when I did started doing several stories. I wrote about India's disinformation crisis, the struggles of India's indigenous populations, the rise of Hindu nationalism and religious persecution of minorities, the legal discrimination against India's transgender community, and many, many others. You can find them on my website. What worked for me was, with journalism, there's always three things that work for me. One is curiosity, the second is connection, and the third is compassion. Curiosity, because, well, it's obvious you have to be inherently curious, and it has landed me many stories. So I remember once I read one of the leading Indian dailies published a 30-word news report about these two women who were found dead in their home, and I just thought it was because the hospitals were overcrowded, but something didn't feel right to me, and it was just a 30-word report. I dug and I dug and I dug, and I visited the village, and I found out that there were some real patriarchal forces at play that wouldn't let the women get treatment, which led to their deaths. Connections, because again, they can be invaluable sources of stories. I remember I used to go to the court, and I used to meet this under trial, and somehow we got talking, and I just used to ask him casually. I wasn't expecting anything out of him, and how's your trial going, how many hearings have you had, is the judge showing up, etc., etc. And I knew him because the person I actually wanted to talk to, his lawyer was representing him as well. And then he got out of prison, and he got my number from the lawyer, and he called me, and he's like, "Madam, do you know what happens in prison? From sex to TV, to television sets to bathtubs, everything is available in prison for a price." And the rate card that I spoke about, he actually gave me a rate card of everything that is available in prison and how much it's available for. In fact, he told me that the more illegal a thing, the more easier it is. It's just that it's more expensive. So that, again, connections can land you stories, and I have really relied on these throughout my journalistic career. And third, of course, is compassion, a genuine desire to do something good, to use our privilege, to change is a very big word. To, even if you can help a few people, that is change. And using and if you're genuinely compassionate, I think that shows in your work. Somebody was telling me that people who've read Homebound do not think of it as poverty porn, and of course I was conscious of it. But then I discussed the depiction of slums in the book the other day at Sciences Po, and I realized that I wasn't conscious about the depiction, that it came from within me, that I'm genuinely, it's pompous, but I'm genuinely compassionate, and that's why I did not make it into poverty porn. So it comes consciously and it comes unconsciously as well. I think what works for me as a journalist is trying to find human stories in the dead data, trying to extend a voice to the voiceless. I have had a long battle with myself as to, who am I to tell their stories? And then I realized, but how will they tell their stories? The indigenous populations of India, for instance, they're not doctors, they're not journalists, they're not in political positions. So someone has to tell their stories until they tell their stories themselves. It's us who have to tell their stories. So I think realizing that, going through those struggles is important. Again, focusing on small changes, not being afraid of rejection. I cannot stress this enough, especially as a freelance journalist. Rejection, you face rejection every day, and I have developed such a thick skin now that reject me and I will not give a, you know what the word is. I have started recognizing that, they're not rejecting the idea, they're rejecting the idea, they're not rejecting me. And as young students who are starting off, I think you need to take rejection a lot less seriously than we do. Applying for awards really worked for me. It sounds shallow, but I apply for many awards, I win many awards, and that really keeps me going at times, because journalism is very difficult, especially in India, and you can find 100 reasons not to do it. So any kind of validation, any kind of encouragement that keeps you going, please go for it, even if it's externally. No matter how much people are telling you that you shouldn't rely on it, I say rely on it. Put your work out there. So what if it's rejected? So what if it doesn't win? Just put your work out there. Another thing that works for me is that sorting. This is, I don't think you're expecting me to say this, but money. Money is always a big problem, and I realize that I think change should be the highest paid job, but unfortunately it isn't. So what I did was I realized that I need to have money. So I do a certain number of stories every month where I know that I'm going to get enough money. And I realized that doing science stories gets you a lot of money. So I started writing science stories. And now I just make sure that they intersect, because I've done this for a while. I make sure that they intersect with human rights concerns as well. So, for instance, I did a story for Chemical and Engineering News recently. They paid me $2 a word, and that story was about the chemical methanol. And although it was a very science story, there was a human rights concern, because I had done that story around a series of methanol poisonings in India, where people in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu had consumed methanol laced liquor, and how that thing happens around the world, and what it means for the socio-economic circumstances of these people. So find a way to earn your money. It does not have to be something very different from your writing. Like I found this, you can find something, but secure your money, because otherwise you're not going to be a journalist, you're not going to be a writer, you're just going to be miserable. Um, Being thorough to avoid litigation. I always say this, in India, litigation is the national sport. So being thorough and with to avoid litigation, to avoid pushback, I transcribe every word. I just did a story which was 6,000 words, and my transcripts ran into 250-word pages. Distance, knowing when it's getting too much, when to step back, and when to breathe. Now, while I was freelancing, last 4 pages, I promise. While I was freelancing, we came upon the pandemic, and that's when my first novel and my third book, Homebound, happened. A bit about the novel: it is so basically India does have a labor ministry, but when we imposed the lockdown, which is one of the strictest in the world, probably the strictest in the world, we did that at a 4-hour notice, and somehow everybody forgot that we had a migrant workforce, and they're in the cities, and they would want to go home too. So that led to this exodus where these migrant workers, hundreds of millions of them, started walking home on foot, and hundreds of kilometers, and many of them died on the way. And I went to the highway, and I met one of them, an old woman, and I told her, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "I'm going home." And I'm like, you say dadi, so it's sort of granny. I'm like, "Granny, do you realize there are no cars or buses? How are you going to go?" She's like, "I'll walk." And I'm like, "Do you know how far it is?" And it was some 700 kilometers or something. And I'm like, "But you will die." And she's like, "No, I'll die only upon reaching home." And I was flabbergasted. I was like, "What is this?" And then I saw that it was all around us. It was everywhere. These people had just packed up their bags, packed up their lives in 2 bags, and they were just walking home. And I wanted to do a nonfiction book, but because I'm an independent journalist, I do not have a press card. So, and I had to write it because the story wouldn't leave me. And that's when I turned to fiction. And again, I did not realize, oh my God, that was horrible. And it opened me to a world of insecurities. I was like, who am I to be writing fiction? I've read like 3 novels in my life. I haven't even read Harry Potter. How can I write fiction? And what on earth are narrative arcs anyway? I mean, I had my, journalistic mind conflict with everything. I mean, so fiction says that there should be a narrative arc, your hero or every character should change from the beginning to the between the beginning to the end of the story, and I just couldn't agree with it. I'm like, okay, if, in real life, when a person has been killed, he doesn't have a chance to fulfill his narrative arc. His narrative arc is done. A killer who kills, so for instance, Vijay Palande, the serial killer, he is defending himself. He does not have a narrative arc. So basically, I was just confused. I do not know how to navigate fiction, really. So I made a rule. I made a rule that stayed true to the narrative, to the humans who inspired it. No imagined atrocities, no made up brutalities, no fictional victories. Just what happened, just what really happened. And that in turn helped me create the architecture of this book. The victories and atrocities became the plot points. For the characters, I started, I prepared character biographies. I read this somewhere that, have your characters sit across you on the table and ask them questions. So I had those conversations with my characters. I felt a bit crazy, but it really worked. And when I had a chance in late 2020, I made a trip. I went to the villages. I spoke to migrant workers. I spoke to cops who arrested them, lawyers who defended them, NGOs that helped them along the way. I walked the way that the migrants walked. Of course, not the entire 900 kilometers. I was in an air conditioned car, but I walked as much as I could, and everybody knows I hate walking, so it was not so much. For again, research saved me, and a real passion for the story. I believed that the Exodus belonged to history, with other exoduses triggered by wars, famines, and natural disasters, and that got me through the uncertainty of being able to finish this book. What worked was. Discipline. I realized before that, I think I used to always rely on the muse, but I realized that it's very, very, it's not reliable. It doesn't show up, especially when you want it to. So I created a schedule for myself that I have to be at my desk from this hour to this hour, and I have to write. And that blinking cursor, it really taunts you. So you do end up writing. So discipline over muse. I realized that fear and procrastination were a part of the process. I accepted that still waste time. I'm writing a first draft right now, and my room is the cleanest it'll ever be because that's what I do. I waste time, but then I have recognized that wasting time is also a part of the process. One thing I did was naming the inner critic in me, and mine is called Cersei from Game of Thrones. And every time I criticize myself and I'm like, I can't do this, she shows up and I'm like, yeah, there you are. I was expecting you. And giving her a name reduces her power over me. So that was also a part of my process. Writing a first draft only for the structure. Again, guys, just when you write, I still do this. It's very tedious writing drafts after drafts after drafts, but you have to write a horrible first draft, what they call a vomit draft, and that give just have the structure in place and everything else follows. Rewriting until the book was readable, being open to criticism from agents and editors, taking half a day at a time. With writing, it's not one day at a time, it's half a day at a time. Whenever I think about the entire book, I get paralyzed. I think that, and now we're finally down to the conclusion. So that's what Homebound was. That's how Homebound came about, and it was published to widespread critical acclaim. But I was still underconfident, and about my fiction, I was still underconfident about my fiction, not as confident as I am about. Nonfiction. So in 2022, I took a year off from my journalism. I was 6 or 7 months off from my journalism. I studied fiction, uh, writing. I studied how to write fiction through books and online courses, and then I came up with an idea. It was about the novel was called Pride Dominion. I researched it for 6 months. I wrote the first draft and a part of the second draft, and then I abandoned it. It was based in 2075, and I could not picture myself there. And again, I realized that it was analysis paralysis because I had done too much research. So when I talk about research, I realized that there is a thing called too much research, and that was one that crippled me because I had so much information that I got completely lost. But then there was a more important reason I realized why I couldn't do that book. It was because I was doing doing it for the wrong reasons. I started that book after September 2022, and this was the time when I was called by the Mumbai Anti-Terrorism Squad for an inquiry, and they believed I was a terrorist. I'm not, I swear. And they thought I was a terrorist, and it was because I was doing a story. So India got partitioned in 1947, and I was doing a story about this YouTube channel that was reuniting people separated during the partition. And because the YouTube channel was based in Pakistan, they thought that I had something to do with them. Nothing came out of it, and but it was 3 months, and it was a lot of. It was really traumatic because they asked me about my little brother, and it was crazy. Anyway, so I came out of it. The process itself had become the punishment, and I decided, you know what, I'm not doing this. I'm not being a journalist. Considering the circumstances in the country, I am never going to write another news report again. I am not going to write anything political. To hell with all this. And that's when I came up with that idea, and it was based in 2075. It had nothing to do with the politics of today. I was so easy to escape everything, but I just couldn't do it. I knew it wouldn't land me in jail, but I couldn't do it. And but late last year, I started doing journalism again. I was very, very pissed. There was a very controversial law that was enacted. Indians were going to war zones for work, and I was obviously pissed. And I went back to journalism slowly and steadily. I started again, and now I am in my complete mood to wreck processes that do not benefit the marginalized. And thanks to Ariel, now I'm back to fiction as well. And I'm just wrapping up my first, this novel, which is about the influence of ISIS in India and how the lawmakers and law enforcers in Mumbai enable, not enable, but enable people in developing extremist views. So the book is, of course, political, but then I realized that that's who I am. And there's another thing that I realized, that that's what you call a narrative arc. Thank you.
Thank you, Puja. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure listening to you. And I'm sure you all felt it, but this human side, you compassionate and kind, and it really comes from the heart, including very private confessions. Thank you so much. I have tons of questions, but yeah, Monica, go ahead. Sorry.
About discipline, and can you tell us a little bit about your writing routine and how you said it's important to waste time, and how do you waste time?
These days I'm waking up at 6 and I have my coffee, and I go down for a little walk, and I start at 7:30. And I actually need, ideally in an ideal world, I mean, I have decided that I'm going to write till 12:30. In an ideal world, I should be writing for 5 hours, but then I'll write for an hour, then I'll go for a walk, and then that walk will extend to a phone call, and it will just keep extending. But I have set a limit of 15 minutes for myself, that okay, waste 15 minutes but come back. So that's what I do. And when it's still not working, there's a thing called Pomodoro technique, where you set a timer for 25 minutes, you write for 25 minutes, you break for 5 minutes. So I do that. So I mean, I've realized it's okay to waste time, because writing is really hard work, because you're thinking a lot, so it gets kind of exhaustive. So i I go to Instagram, guys. I waste a lot of time. I go to Instagram, I keep scrolling, I'll just read random things, I'll start reading a magazine, I'll talk to people, I'll just call random people I've never spoken to in a long time. Just because, I think, oh, I haven't called them in a long time, I should be calling them, and the time is now. So yeah, I do waste a lot of time. But then I think once you're in it, the book doesn't leave you. I mean, when I'm really in it, I cannot sleep. And I have hardly slept these past few days because I'm constantly thinking. So I know that even when I'm wasting time, I am going to go back to it. So that's what works. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It was fascinating to understand how you work and how you move from fiction to non-fiction. What you said about the novel you abandoned is absolutely fantastic. I have a very precise question. You said that as a journalist, it was possible for you to have access to documents that the government is trying to hide. So can you tell us a little more about this?
So it's called the Right to Information Act, whereby you can file an application and the concerned department will send you the document. If they do not send it, you file appeals after appeals, and you get those documents. So in France as well, you have a law that facilitates that. In the UK, it's called Freedom of Information Act, but I'm very sure that there's something in France as well. So I usually file those applications to get some information which is not easily available in public domain. Yeah. My pleasure.
Okay, do we have more questions from the floor? No, well, I have some. Oh, I'm sorry, Antonella, I hadn't seen you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to enter into your creative process. My question is about the importance of the language in your writing. How much attention do you pay to your language, and what language, because you are multilingual, so do all your languages enter into your creative process?
No, not really. You know, in fact, I realized because I studied in English, I think in English, so it's only English when I write. But I realized that it's so bad that I had to do an interview for a podcast in Hindi, and I couldn't do it because I was translating from English to Hindi in my head. So it was incredible, and that's when I tried to write a little bit in Hindi because I said, what's wrong with me? But no, I think it's purely and only English. Yeah.
Questions from students? Don't hesitate. Okay, colleagues as well. No, okay. So, Céline.
Yeah, thank you very much, Puja. You talked about your structure, that you do that before you do your research.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how you do that, because I guess you need to do some research to know what you're going to talk about. So how do you organize your structure before? Because we academics tend to do that, to think about the structure before, because we have an idea that we want to push forwards. But I would have thought that maybe if you don't know about the subject, then you can't really structure your...
No, so I think
thoughts.
with I do some preliminary research before, but it's not like proper research. So with the Gangster on the Run, I knew that I had divided his life into 4 parts, so I knew that was the structure. With my first book, I knew that this is going to be the structure because as I said, it was as the story unraveled to me. Then there are various ways. I mean, I think so. For instance, if you're doing a book about say places, your geography becomes the structure. So I think you have some idea, some about the contours of the book, and I think that helps me have my structure in place and then do the research and then maybe move things around. So I think what's important is that we realize that it's very flexible. Books change. Books have a way of, evolving and becoming what they want to be. So I think recognizing that and not being too rigid with it also works. But having a structure really works for me because then I know what goes everywhere. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
I have many questions for you, Puja. About Homebound, because you were talking about voice, I was wondering at what point came the idea of writing this novel in the form of letters from the voice of a teenager?
So I think the teenager, I think I was pretty set on that from the beginning because when we talk about migrant workers in India, we imagine men who've picked up their bags, come to the cities, died on the streets, and we don't think about women, and we still think about women, but we don't think about children at all. So that's why I wanted it to be a young girl, have that perspective, because that perspective's hardly ever been covered. And why it's an epistolary novel, because I wanted to create some sort of urgency, and that because she's a child, because she's hopeful, uh, those letters reflected that hope that maybe the journalist will show up and rescue me. So I think it was a way of embodying the hope of these migrant workers as well, because nobody really expected the tragedy to befall them at the scale that it did. So I think these were the reasons. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question about journalism, and I'm sorry to hear we met, twice in October, and I wasn't aware that journalism was really maybe something that you were going to turn the page on, as it were. But I would like you to know that as an academic, there's not a single week that has gone by in the past 25 years when I haven't thought I have to give up this job. I can't take it anymore. It's not for me. But I would like. Okay, first of all, I'm curious about the press card. It's independent journalists should have a press card.
It's crazy. There was an application window in November, but I again missed it. It happens once a year. It's like, I don't know, an annual event where you apply for a press card or something. So I haven't gotten around to it yet. But no, independent journalists usually work without press cards. So we have to actually Google ourselves and show them that, listen, these are my bylines and this is my website if somebody asks you. So you have to actually do that. And I've written for like any publication, the BBC, CNN, Guardian, Washington Post, National Geographic, everybody. And yet we do not have a press card.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of all professions, I mean, journalism is really,
there's no organized body of freelance journalists.
Plenty of, there are plenty of freelancers.
So there's no organized body of freelance journalists that can disperse these press cards, no recognized body.
But so beyond that, I was wondering what you thought about, having probably met journalists from all types of places, working in all types of fields. I was wondering whether you would, this is something that we've been hearing for the past decade or decades. Journalism is now dangerous. And it's so essential to our democracies and our societies. And I wanted to have your intuition about why it's changed when otherwise so many procedures are now there to protect human rights, to we've got social media that makes it a lot easier to alert on scandals. Anyways, I wanted to know what if your own move away from journalism was really something that we should all be worried about.
What if you'd asked me this question a year ago, I'd say don't become a journalist. But now I think because of the narrative arc, because I don't feel that way, because in my future, I want to see a lot more courage. And it's getting more difficult because I feel governments are getting more authoritarian. There are there are more ways of cracking down on people. There is digital surveillance. There's so many options. There was this thing called but I can't remember its name, but there was this entire scandal where journalists were being tracked in India. It was globally. So I think it is because governments are getting more authoritarian. They're trying to tighten the grip. And because of the rise of digital media, journalism itself is, it has given avenues to more voices, but it has somehow diluted the essence of journalism, because anybody with a camera is a journalist now. So I think there's a lot of misinformation as well, which has also led to greater crackdown and giving an excuse to governments to be able to crack down. So in India, they have proposed a law whereby they can delete anything that has been put up by a media outlet or journalist if it's disinformation, and they are the only ones who are able to decide whether or not it's disinformation. So I think it's a mixture of many things that has made journalism more difficult. In India, it's absolute and pure religious nationalism and authoritarianism, as in many countries around the world. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I got 4 keywords, that kept coming back in your talk. So trust and patience when it comes to relationships in particular, and discipline and structure when it comes to work. So I had a question relating to the first. You said you've experienced rejection. Have you also experienced deception, or at least disappointment in your relationships you're trying to build with the people you interviewed and talked to?
Well, they get too cozy sometimes. They keep calling me and that gets a bit annoying because, you know, like keep some distance. But disappointment, I mean, there are always people who don't want to talk to you. I was actually talking to this former militant, and I interviewed him for days. And we had this very nice conversation. I wanted to do a story about him and, you know, how he was a militant in Kashmir. And we spoke for days, and then that story never worked out because he backed out. So, I mean, that happens, but then I think it's just all part of the process. It's really okay. Yeah.
And then concerning the second set, so discipline, structure, and relating to your work, creative process and writing, I was wondering about if you had experienced the unreliability of certain of the sources you've used. It's a question of reliability, unreliability of sources.
So I think now I'm more conscious of it because, as I said, litigation is the national sport in India. So now I'm more conscious, and I try to have two sources for everything, but a minimum of one source where documents are available. Otherwise, at least two sources. Yeah. Especially when I'm working with memories.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Let me check the time. Are we done with questions? At least. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was just wondering, because you work or you've worked with many different publications all across, like you said, the National Geographic, but also in Distant Times, etc. Is there a difference in your process or the way that you write, or I mean, I'm guessing the subjects that you write on when you work for, say, an American or a British newspaper, and when you write for an Indian newspaper?
Then there's no difference in so there are different kinds of stories. So I could do either a news report, or I could do an opinion piece or an analysis piece, or recently I did a piece of narrative journalism. So depending on, this piece of narrative journalism was for Neiman Reports, which is published out of Harvard, and they do long form writing on the state of journalism. So that was very different because it was a piece of narrative journalism. So it had a beginning, a middle, and end. It had a narrative arc. It had plot points. So that was different. But that I wouldn't do that for my normal stories. For National Geographic, it was proper hardcore journalism. I did a story about the rise of this brain-eating amoeba because of climate change across the world, and that was a heavily reported feature where I spoke to doctors, I spoke to academics, I spoke to scientists. So I think it depends on the type of story you're doing and not the type of publication. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I suggest we take a break now. You can ask Puja more questions over coffee, of course. I'm inviting you to join me, thanking her again for a very excellent. Thank you so much.